They say loyalty is the heartbeat of the pack, but today mine just flatlined. Standing in the center of the great hall, the scent of tallow candles and betrayal thick in the air, I watched my alpha, the man I once would have died for, tear my life apart with a single cold decree. I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. Even as the shadow of his hand loomed over me, I just wondered if he realized he was losing the only wolf who actually knew how to find the hidden salt stores for the winter. My name is Gunnora, and I've just been rejected. Not because I'm weak, but because I'm too damn good at thinking for myself.
Welcome back to Z's Romance. I am so glad you've joined us for this journey into the deep woods and the heat of the hearth. Before we dive into the winter pines of today's story, I want to take a moment to connect with you. Our community of listeners spans the entire globe, and I love seeing where our pack gathers. Head down to the comments right now and let me know, which part of the world are you listening from today? Thank you for being here and for being part of this community. Now, settle in. The mountain is waiting.
Gunnora, you really are a spectacular disappointment. Alpha Vance's voice echoed off the damp stone walls of the hall, dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for a pup that had just soiled the communal furs. I stood my ground, my wool tunic damp with the evening mist, refusing to let my knees buckle. I prefer the term tactically independent, Vance, I replied, my voice remarkably steady for a woman currently being stripped of her soul. Refusing to set fire to a barn full of innocent villagers isn't a failure. It's called having a personality. You should try it sometime. A ripple of hushed gasps circulated through the pack gathered in the shadows. We were the Iron Reach clan, the most feared hunters in these woods. Yet here I was, back-chatting the man who held my biological leash. Vance took a step toward me, his presence heavy and suffocating. In the 16th century, power wasn't measured in coin, it was measured in the heat of your blood and the length of your shadow. Right now, his shadow was eating me whole. He didn't reach for a blade. He didn't need to. In our world, the most painful wounds were delivered through the bond. You were my best tracker, he hissed, his eyes turning that flat, predatory amber. But a weapon that won't strike is just a piece of scrap. I, Vance of the Iron Reach, hereby reject you. I strip you of your name, your rank, and your place by our fire. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. It wasn't magic. I didn't believe in the old wives' tales of glowing sigils or moon blessings. This was raw, physical rejection. My inner wolf, usually a steady, roaring fire in my chest, suddenly felt like it was being doused in ice water. The connection to the pack, the hum of 20 other heartbeats that had lived in the back of my mind since birth, snapped. The silence was deafening. It was a physical blow that sent me staggering back toward the heavy oak doors. Wait, I wheezed, clutching my chest. Does this mean I don't have to do the communal laundry anymore? Because if so, you've really overplayed your hand. Vance didn't laugh. He didn't even sneer. He simply turned his back. That was the final insult. To the pack, I no longer existed. I was a ghost standing in a room full of my former family. Two of the Alpha's enforcers, men I had trained with since I was a girl, stepped forward. They didn't use iron. They used their sheer bulk to shove me toward the threshold. I hit the mud outside the hall with a wet thud, the freezing rain of the mountain pass immediately soaking through my clothes. Go die in the savage wilds, Gunnora, one of them muttered, though he wouldn't look me in the eye. Maybe the rogue will find you before the frost does. The heavy doors groaned shut, the iron bolts sliding home with a finality that echoed in my hollow chest. I sat there in the mud for a moment, the cold biting into the places where my pack bond used to keep me warm. I was alone, no name, no home, and according to the legends, I was about to be hunted. I stood up, shaking the mud from my hands, and looked toward the dark, towering pines of the forbidden forest. My wolf was shivering, but I wasn't. I was furious. I took my first step into the deep shadows, the scent of damp earth, and something much darker, much more primal, rising to meet me. The pines didn't just grow here, they conspired. Their branches, heavy with frozen needles and the weight of a century's worth of secrets, knit together above my head like the ribs of a giant, rotting cathedral. I'd spent my life in the woods, but the savage wilds were different. There was no pack song here, no communal safety, just the wind whistling through the canyons and the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Great plan, Gunnora," I muttered, pulling my sodden wool cloak tighter around my shoulders. Reject the guy with the keys to the smokehouse and walk into the one place where everything is famously hungry. Genius, truly. My inner wolf was a silent, shivering knot of anxiety. The rejection wasn't just a social snub, it was a physical amputation. Without the alpha's tether, my body felt like it was forgetting how to regulate its own heat. Every step through the knee-deep snow felt like wading through cooling lead. I tried to shift, to let the fur and the thick muscle of my four-legged form take the brunt of the cold, but nothing happened. The biological trigger was dead. I was just a woman in a wet dress and a heavy cloak stumbling through a medieval nightmare. I tripped over a hidden root, face-planting into a drift of snow that tasted of pine needles and ancient dirt. For a second, I just stayed there. It was actually quite comfortable, in a "I'm about to become a permanent ice sculpture" kind of way. I could see the headlines now. Gunnora the Fierce, found frozen with a sarcastic expression. "Get up," I hissed to myself, pushing my frozen palms into the muck. "You are an iron reach. Or you were. Now you're just Gunnora, and Gunnora doesn't die in a bush." I scrambled up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. That's when I smelt it. It wasn't the scent of my pack, that stale, dusty smell of too many bodies in one hall. This was something else. It was the smell of deep winter rain hitting hot stones. It was cedarwood and something heavy, dark, and undeniably masculine. It was a scent so thick it felt like I could reach out and grab it. It was a rogue. Panic should have been my first reaction. Rogues were supposed to be feral, mind-shattered beasts who had lost their humanity to the isolation. But as that scent filled my lungs, my shivering actually slowed. My heart, instead of leaping into my throat, settled into a steady, heavy thrum. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever smelt, which was highly inconvenient given that I was currently defenseless and looking very much like a snack. The mist ahead of me parted, not with a magical shimmer, but with the slow, physical gravity of something massive moving through it. A shadow taller than any man I'd ever seen detached itself from the trunk of an ancient oak. I reached for my belt, forgetting for a split second that my knife had been taken during the ceremony. My fingers brushed empty leather. "Well," I whispered, staring at the looming silhouette, "if you're going to eat me, I should warn you, I'm mostly spite and gristle at this point. You'll have terrible indigestion." The figure didn't move. It just watched me with eyes that caught the faint, dying light of the moon. Not glowing, just sharp, silver, and intensely focused. My vision began to blur at the edges, the cold finally winning the argument. My knees hit the snow first, then my hip. Just before the world turned into a smudge of gray and black, I felt a pair of hands reach for me. They weren't cold, they were searingly, impossibly hot. Chapter 3. The Heat of the Rogue. I was dead. That was the only logical explanation for why I felt like I was floating on a cloud of heated velvet. Then I realized the cloud was breathing, and it smelled like rain-drenched cedar. I blinked my eyes open, my lashes still heavy with melted frost. I wasn't in the snow anymore. I was draped across a chest that felt like a slab of sun-warmed granite. I was being carried, the steady, powerful stride of my captor, or savior, jolting me just enough to keep me conscious. I looked up, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The man holding me had a jawline that could have been carved from the very cliffs I'd just tumbled down. His hair was dark, damp from the storm, and his skin radiated a heat that was nearly intoxicating. This was Bastian. It had to be. The rogue the pack spoke of in hushed, terrified whispers. "You're very warm," I managed to croak out. My voice sounded like someone dragging a rake over gravel. His gaze dropped to mine for a fraction of a second. His eyes were a startling, grounded silver, the color of a polished iron blade. He didn't say a word. He just adjusted his grip. His large hand splayed across my ribs, pulling me closer against the heavy wool of his tunic. The physical contact was electric. Without the pack bond, I was a raw nerve, and his presence was the only thing keeping the cold from shattering me. "If this is the part where you keep me in a cage, could you at least make sure it's near a fire?" I mumbled, my head lolling against his shoulder. I have very high standards for my kidnappings. A small, almost imperceptible huff of air escaped his nose. Was that a laugh, or just a rogue's version of telling me to shut up?
He carried me toward a structure that looked like it had grown out of the mountainside itself, a cabin of heavy stone and thick timber, its chimney belching a steady stream of gray smoke into the night sky. He kicked the door open, the heavy wood groaning on its iron hinges, and the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs rushed out to meet us. He didn't put me in a cage. He walked straight to a massive bed piled high with furs, bear, wolf, and deer, and laid me down with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the sheer size of him. The room was lit only by the orange glow of a dying fire in a large stone hearth. I watched him move as he turned to the fire, stoking the embers with a heavy iron poker. Every movement was a study in controlled power. He was a rogue, an outcast, yet he moved with a sovereignty that my alpha could never hope to mimic. He turned back to me, holding a wooden cope of water. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping significantly under his weight. He didn't ask permission. He simply slid a hand behind my neck to lift my head. "Drink," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that I felt in my bones more than I heard in my ears. I took a sip, the cool water soothing my throat. I stared at him, my fierce streak returning as the warmth started to seep back into my limbs. "What are you? And why aren't you currently trying to eat my heart? My pack was very specific about the rogue protocol." He set the cope down and looked at me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made my skin tingle. "Your pack," he said, slowly, his voice like grinding stones, "doesn't know a thing about what I want."
Chapter 4. The Tallow and the Timber. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the hearth and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Bastian's presence. It was a strange sensation to be so physically close to a man I'd been taught to fear, yet to feel more secure than I ever had within the walls of my own village. Bastian stood up and walked to a heavy wooden table where a single tallow candle flickered. He picked up a bowl of something steaming and brought it over. It was a thick stew, the scent of venison and wild onions hitting me like a physical blow to my hunger. "Eat," he commanded. I sat up, the furs sliding down my shoulders. I realized then that my wet, muddy cloak was gone, replaced by a heavy, dry tunic that definitely didn't belong to me. It smelled entirely of him. "I suppose thank you is the traditional response," I said, taking the bowl. My hands were still shaking slightly, and as he handed me a carved wooden spoon, his fingers brushed mine. The heat was instantaneous. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated recognition. My wolf, dormant and cold since the rejection, gave a small, tentative wag of its tail in the back of my mind. It didn't need a pack bond. It just needed him. I ate, the food bringing the color back to my face. Bastian watched me, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He was wearing a simple linen shirt tucked into leather breeches, the laces at his throat undone to reveal the corded muscles of his neck. "You're a long way from the Iron Reach fires, little wolf," he said, his silver eyes tracking the movement of the spoon. "I was fired," I said, regaining my snark as the nutrients hit my system. "And don't call me Little Wolf. I've brought down stags bigger than you."
"I doubt that," he replied, a shadow of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He leaned in, placing one hand on the bed beside my hip. The proximity was staggering. I could feel the heat radiating off him in waves. "But I like the fire in you. Most people would be weeping by now." "I don't weep," I said, setting the bowl aside and meeting his gaze. "I plan. I survive. And right now, I'm wondering what the catch is. Nobody in this century does anything for free. What do you want, rogue?" Bastian didn't flinch. He leaned in even closer, until I could see the flecks of dark gray in his silver irises. The scent of him, that cedar and rain, was overwhelming now, filling every sense I had left. "I want exactly what I have, a fierce woman in my bed who doesn't know when to stay quiet." My breath hitched. The intimacy in the room was so thick, it felt like I could reach out and stir it with my finger. He didn't move to touch me further, but the space between us was vibrating with a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way his eyes were lingering on my mouth. "I'm not staying," I lied, though my body was already betraying me, leaning imperceptibly towards his heat. "We'll see," he said, his voice a low, honeyed growl. Suddenly, a sound cut through the romantic haze. It wasn't a howl or a scream. It was the sharp, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of something heavy striking the stone wall of the cabin from the outside. Not an attack, but a signal. Bastian's expression shifted instantly, from simmering heat to cold, hard steel. He stood up, reaching for a heavy axe leaning by the door.
Chapter 5. The Iron Bell. Bastian didn't move like a man afraid of an intruder. He moved like a man who'd been waiting for an excuse to break something. He gripped the heavy handle of the iron axe, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The thud, thud, thud against the stone wall continued, rhythmic and insistent, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. "Is that a doorbell or a death warrant?" I asked, sliding off the bed. My legs were a bit shaky, but my pride was as solid as a castle wall. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth, mostly because it felt better to have something heavy in my hand than to stand there looking like a Victorian damsel in a borrowed shirt. Bastian glanced over his shoulder, his silver eyes sweeping over me. He didn't tell me to get back in bed. He didn't tell me I was too weak to help. He just nodded toward the heavy oak door. "It's the perimeter line. Someone or something just tripped the weighted bell on the eastern ridge." "The eastern ridge? That's the steep side," I said, my tactical brain clicking into gear. "Nobody climbs that unless they're desperate or stupid," which, granted, describes about 80% of my former pack. Bastian stepped toward the door, his presence filling the small entryway. "Stay behind me. If it's a scout, they're not here for a chat." He pulled the heavy iron bolt back with a sharp clack and swung the door open. The freezing night air rushed in, smelling of pine needles and the sharp, metallic scent of an approaching snowstorm. I peeked around his massive arm, expecting a line of Iron Reach warriors. Instead, there was nothing but the swirling gray mist and the dark, jagged silhouettes of the trees. Then, a low rumbling sound drifted through the air. Not a howl, but a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself.
Bastian stiffened. He didn't lower the axe, but his posture shifted from executioner to watchful guardian. He stepped out onto the stone porch, and I followed him, the cold biting at my bare ankles. "Bastian?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He was looking up at the ridge. High above us, 2 golden pinpricks of light appeared in the darkness. Not magical, not glowing, just the reflected firelight of the cabin hitting the eyes of a massive mountain wolf. It was easily twice the size of any wolf in my pack, its fur the color of ancient slate. It wasn't shifting, it was just watching us. "Is that a friend of yours?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. "Because if he's coming for dinner, we're going to need a bigger bowl of stew." "It's a messenger." Bastian muttered, his voice a low growl that mirrored the wolf's. The wild wolves don't like the Iron Reach scent. They're telling me the borders have been crossed. The massive wolf gave one final resonant chuff of air and vanished back into the shadows of the pines. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing in on us like a physical weight. Bastian turned to me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in his eyes. It was a fierce, possessive heat. He reached out, his large hand cupping the side of my face. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, his skin searingly hot against the mountain chill. "You're coming for you, Gunnora," he said, his voice thick with a promise that made my blood sing. "But they'll have to pull this cabin down stone by stone before they touch a hair on your head."
Chapter 6. The United Front. The door was shut and bolted again, but the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. The cozy recovery room vibe had evaporated, replaced by a charged electric tension. Bastian was moving around the room, blowing out all but one candle and checking the shutters on the small, high windows. "You're surprisingly calm for a man about to be besieged by the most ill-tempered pack in the north," I said, leaning against the stone mantelpiece. I was trying to look casual, but my heart was doing a frantic jig in my chest. Bastian stopped in front of me. He was so tall I had to tilt my head back just to meet his eyes. "I've lived alone in these woods for a decade, Gunnora. I didn't survive by being surprised." He reached out, his fingers tracing the collar of the oversized tunic I was wearing. "You're shivering." "It's the draft," I lied. "It's the adrenaline," he corrected, his voice dropping to a low, soothing rumble. He stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that made my breath hitch. He didn't feel like a threat, he felt like an anchor. He placed both hands on the mantel on either side of my waist, effectively pinning me between his body and the warm stone. "The rejection broke your connection to the pack. Your body is trying to find a new rhythm. It's looking for a lead." "I don't need a lead," I snapped, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "I'm a master tracker. I lead myself." Bastian's eyes darkened, a predatory, supportive heat swirling in the silver. "Then lead us, Gunnora. Tell me what your gut says. You know their tactics better than anyone." I looked at him, surprised. In the Iron Reach pack, my advice was followed because it was effective, but it was always framed as obeying the alpha's weapon. Bastian was asking for my expertise as an equal. "They'll come in a pincer movement," I said, my voice gaining strength. "They think you're a feral beast who won't use strategy. They'll send 2 scouts to the front to distract you while the alpha and his best 3 climbers come over the ridge we just saw. They'll wait for the moon to hit its peak so they can use the shadows of the pines to mask their approach." Bastian nodded, his gaze fixed on my lips. "And how do we stop them?" "We don't stop them," I said, a slow, fierce smirk spreading across my face. "We let them get exactly where they want to be, and then we show them that a rogue and a rejected wolf have absolutely nothing left to lose." The intimacy of the moment was staggering. We were talking about a life-and-death siege, yet all I could focus on was the way his chest rose and fell against mine, the scent of cedar and rain-washed stone filling my head. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "I like the way you think, little wolf," he whispered. "I told you not to call me that," I murmured, my hands finding the firm, warm muscle of his forearms. "I'll call you whatever you want, as long as you stay right here." He moved to kiss me, a promise of something deep and primal, when a sudden sharp crack echoed from the roof above us. Not a branch breaking, the sound of a heavy, leather-bound boot landing on the timber. Chapter 7. The Scent of the Alpha. Bastian's head snapped up toward the ceiling, his entire body coiling like a spring. The warmth from a second ago was replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He didn't even have to say anything. I was already moving. I grabbed the heavy iron poker again, and Bastian reached for a leather-wrapped bundle near the door. "They're early," I whispered, my warrior instincts overriding the lingering exhaustion in my limbs. The alpha is impatient. He hates being made to wait, especially by someone he thinks he's already defeated. Bastian didn't go for the door. Instead, he moved to the center of the room and looked up at the heavy crossbeams. The roof is reinforced with iron plating under the thatch. They won't get through the timber easily, but they'll try to smoke us out. "Not if I have anything to say about it," I said. I looked around the room, my eyes landing on a small, heavy trunk in the corner. "Is that where you keep the extra furs?" "Yes. Why?" "Because," I said, a plan forming in my mind with the speed of lightning, "we need to make them come to the door on our terms." Bastian watched me, a look of genuine admiration crossing his face. "You want to bait them." "I want to humiliate them," I corrected. "But first, I need you to do something for me." I stepped toward him, my hand reaching out to touch the pulse point at the base of his throat. It was thudding with a powerful, steady rhythm. "I need you to trust me. My pack, my former pack, they move in a very specific pattern when they think they've won. They get arrogant, they get loud, but the moment they smell something they don't understand, they hesitate." Bastian took my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine. The heat of his palm was like a brand. "I've trusted you since the moment I found you in the snow, Gunnora. What do you need?" "Your scent," I said, stepping even closer until our heartbeats were practically synchronized. "I need to smell like you, completely. If the alpha catches a whiff of me and thinks I've already mated with a rogue, he won't just be angry, he'll be blinded by rage. And a blind alpha is a dead alpha." The silence in the room became heavy, thick with a new kind of tension. Bastian's silver eyes flared, his pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. He pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around my waist with a possessive strength that made my toes curl. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath hot against my skin. He didn't bite. There was no magic in this, no supernatural mark, but the physical act of him scenting me, of his skin rubbing against mine, felt more permanent than any pack bond ever could. "You're mine, Gunnora," he growled into my skin, his voice vibrating through my entire body. I leaned into him, my eyes closing as I breathed in the cedar and rain. We stood there for a heartbeat, two outcasts finding sanctuary in the middle of a storm. Then the air in the room changed. A thin, acrid scent began to drift down from the rafters. It wasn't wood smoke. It was the sharp, unmistakable smell of iron reach pitch, a substance we used to flush out hibernating bears. And then a voice boomed from outside, muffled by the stone but unmistakable in its cruelty. "Gunnora, come out and bring me the rogue's head, or we burn the mountain down with you inside it." I looked at Bastian, a feral, beautiful smile tugging at my lips. "Ready to show them how we treat uninvited guests?" Chapter 8. The Bait and the Burn. The acrid, oily smell of iron reach pitch was beginning to sting my throat, but I didn't cough. I couldn't afford to. Beside me, Bastian was a mountain of silent, coiled muscle. If the alpha thought he was flushing out two panicked animals, he was about to get a very expensive lesson in 16th century architecture and female spite. "I hope you weren't too attached to that thatched roof, Bastian," I whispered, pulling the heavy wool of my borrowed tunic over my nose, because Vance about to give us a very bright, very hot housewarming gift. "It's a small price to pay for the look on his face when he realizes he's been shouting at an empty bed," Bastian rumbled. His hand found mine in the thickening haze, his grip grounding and hot. I smirked behind the wool. Our plan was simple, if a bit reckless. While the smoke drifted down from the rafters, we moved to the secondary cellar, a crawl space Bastian used for storing smoked meats and iron tools. It didn't have a magical exit, just a very heavy, very hidden stone slab that led to the ravine behind the cabin. "On my signal," I said, my heart drumming against my ribs. "We wait for the first torch to hit the thatch. The moment the light flares, they'll all be watching the roof. That's when we drop." "Gunnora," Bastian said, his voice dropping into that low, vibratory register that made my knees feel like they were made of melted tallow. First of all, I said, turning to face him despite the smoke, nobody is losing anyone. And second, if you think I'm leaving you to deal with my ex-alpha alone, you've clearly severely underestimated how much I enjoy a good fight. We're a unit, remember? Or did the rogue forget his manners? Bastian's eyes flared in the dim light, silver and fierce. He didn't argue. He just pulled me flush against him for one searing second, the heat of his body acting as a shield against the encroaching chill of the cellar floor. He smelled of cedar and a promise of violence. Crack! The first torch hit the roof. Above us, the dry timber and straw groaned as the fire took hold, casting a flickering, hellish orange glow through the gaps in the ceiling. The roar of the flames was a physical thing, a hungry beast devouring the sanctuary we had just found. Now, Bastian commanded. We heaved the stone slab back. The cool, damp scent of the earth rushed up to meet us. We dropped into the darkness just as the first beam from the roof collapsed into the center of the cabin. We crawled through the narrow, dirt-walled tunnel, the sound of the inferno fading behind us. My lungs burned and my fingers were raw from the packed earth, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We emerged 50 yards away, hidden by a dense thicket of blackberry brambles and frost-covered ferns. I turned back to look at the cabin. It was a pillar of fire, lighting up the snowy clearing like a beacon. Standing in the light of the blaze was a circle of men in dark cloaks, my former pack. And there, at the front, was Vance. He looked triumphant, his hands on his hips as he watched his handiwork. "He thinks we're in there," I whispered, my hand tightening around the iron poker I'd refused to leave behind. "He thinks he's already won." "Let him think it," Bastian said, his shadow stretching long and terrifying across the snow. Bastian shifted. No magical light, no bones snapping and reknitting, just a fluid biological transition from man to beast, the sheer speed of it a testament to his years of survival. A massive slate-gray wolf now stood where the man had been, his shoulders nearly level with my chest. He didn't growl. He just looked at me, his silver eyes reflecting the fire. "Wait for it," I told him, checking the wind. The scent of the pack was heavy, arrogance, iron, and the alpha's stale dominance, but underneath it, I could smell the hesitation of the younger wolves. Then Vance stepped closer to the burning cabin, a mocking laugh echoing through the trees. "A rogue and a traitor, a fitting end for two dogs." I stepped out from the shadows of the brambles, the firelight catching the fierce, predatory grin on my face. "Actually, Vance, I've always been more of a cat person." Vance froze. The entire pack turned, their eyes widening as they saw me standing there, alive, unscratched, and smelling entirely of the rogue who stood at my back. Chapter 9. The Rhythm of the Hunt. The silence that followed my entrance was louder than the roaring fire behind Vance. I could see the gears turning in his head, the confusion, the rage, and then the dawning realization that he had just burned down a perfectly good cabin for nothing. "Gunnora," he hissed, his hand dropping to the hilt of his heavy iron broadsword. "You should have stayed in the fire. It would have been quicker." "And miss the look on your face? Not a chance," I said, stepping forward. I wasn't just walking. I was hunting. Every muscle in my body felt tuned to a new frequency. The rejection hadn't weakened me. It had removed the static. Beside me, the massive wolf that was Bastian moved in perfect synchronicity. We were a two-headed predator, a nightmare born of the savage wilds. There was no internal conflict here, no doubt about our bond. I knew exactly when he was going to lunge, and he knew exactly when I was going to strike. Vance gestured to his two best enforcers, Bram and Kemp. "Kill the beast. Bring me the woman. I want to personally show her what happens to wolves who forget their place." Bram and Kemp lunged. They didn't shift. They were arrogant enough to think their steel was enough. Big mistake. Bastian was a blur of gray fur and raw power. He met Bram mid-air, the impact sounding like a tree trunk hitting a stone wall. He didn't need magic to be terrifying, he just needed physics and teeth. While Bastian occupied the larger man, I focused on Kemp. Kemp was fast, but I had spent the last 3 years training him. I knew his every weakness. He swung a heavy iron mace toward my head, a clumsy move born of overconfidence. I didn't retreat. I stepped into his guard, the iron poker in my hand acting as an extension of my arm. I parried the mace with a sharp clang, the vibration travels up my arm, and used my momentum to drive my elbow into his throat. He went down with a gagging sound, his eyes bulging. I didn't stop to admire my work. I turned, my eyes locking with Vance's. "Is that the best you've got?" I asked, my voice dripping with the kind of humor that usually gets people stabbed. "I've seen pups in the nursery with better footwork." The alpha let out a roar of pure animalistic fury. He began to shift, his wool tunic tearing at the seams as his body expanded. This was the moment of highest stakes. An alpha in mid-shift was a whirlwind of unpredictable violence. Bastian saw it too. He finished with Bram, the enforcer slumped in the snow, and circled back to my side. He stood between me and the transforming alpha, his fur bristling, a low vibration coming from his chest that I felt in the marrow of my bones. The rest of the pack, the other 15 wolves, were wavering. They saw their beta down, their alpha losing control, and a rogue who looked like he could eat the moon if he felt like it. I reached out and rested my hand on Bastian's shoulder. The physical contact was like a bolt of lightning, grounding me and fueling him. We weren't just two people fighting for survival, we were a sanctuary defending itself. "Don't let him finish the shift, Bastian," I whispered, my voice sharp and clear over the crackle of the embers. "Hit him now." Bastian didn't need to be told twice. He launched himself at the half-shifted alpha, a mountain of slate-gray fury meeting a monster of ego and blood. Chapter 10. The Alpha's Fall. The collision between Bastian and Vance was visceral. There were no flashes of light or mystical shocks, just the sound of two massive bodies hitting the frozen earth and the spray of snow and mud. Vance, caught halfway between his human form and his wolf, was a grotesque mess of raw muscle and misplaced rage. Bastian, however, was in his element. He was the king of this ridge, a rogue who'd spent 10 years fighting for every scrap of territory. He had Vance pinned by the throat, his massive jaws hovering inches from the alpha's jugular. The rest of the pack stood frozen, their torches flickering in the wind. They looked at me, then at the burning remains of the cabin, and finally at their defeated leader. I stepped forward, the heat from the fire at my back making me look like a vengeful spirit of the mountains. I didn't have a crown, and I didn't have a pack bond, but I had never felt more like a leader. "Look at him!" I shouted, my voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "Look at your alpha! He burned your winter supplies and sent your brothers to die for a grudge. He calls me a traitor because I wouldn't kill innocents, but who is the real traitor here?" Vance let out a choked, wet growl, struggling beneath Bastian's weight. Bastian tightened his grip, a massive snarl vibrating through the clearing. One of the younger wolves, a boy named Finn who'd I'd taught to track his first rabbit, lowered his spear. "He said you were dead, Gunnora. He said the rogue had eaten you." "Does it look like I've been eaten, Finn?" I asked, walking right up to the edge of the pack's circle. I was unarmed, save for the iron poker, but not a single one of them moved to stop me. Bastian shifted back. It was a slow, deliberate return to his human form, his naked chest gleaming with sweat and the reflected light of the fire. He stood up, towering over the broken alpha, and reached out for me. I took his hand, our fingers locking in a grip that said more than any pack oath ever could. We were two outcasts, two broken things, standing together against the world that had rejected us. "The fight is over," Bastian said, his voice a deep, resonant command that seemed to settle the very air. The pack members scrambled to pick up the unconscious Bram and the shivering, broken Vance. They didn't look back as they retreated into the darkness of the trees, their torches fading until they were nothing but tiny sparks in the distance. The clearing was silent now, save for the dying hiss of the cabin's ruins. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But as I turned to Bastian, the exhaustion didn't matter. He was looking at me with a look of such pure, unadulterated devotion that it took my breath away. He didn't care about the cabin. He didn't care about the pack. He only cared that I was standing there. "You were magnificent," he whispered, his hands finding my waist and pulling me into the circle of his heat. "I was tactical," I corrected, though I was smiling. "And I'm also homeless. Again. You really need to work on your home security, Bastian." He laughed, a real, rich sound that filled the clearing. He leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a promise of the peace we had finally earned. "I have a second cabin," he murmured against my mouth. "Further up the ridge. It's smaller, but the bed is bigger." I was about to respond with something suitably sharp when the ground beneath us suddenly gave a violent, unnatural shudder. Not a shift in the earth, a deep, resonant boom that echoed from the very heart of the mountain. Bastian pulled me closer, his eyes scanning the horizon. From the peak above us, a single, massive plume of black smoke began to rise, blotting out the stars. "Gunnora," Bastian said, his voice dropping all humor. "The mountain isn't just a mountain."
Chapter 11. The Earth's Indigestion. The ground didn't just shake, it groaned, a deep tectonic bellyache that vibrated right up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. Above us, the mountain peak was no longer a silent sentinel of stone. That black plume of smoke was thick, acrid, and smelled like the very bowels of the world had decided to vent their frustrations on us. "Bastian," I said, grabbing his arm to keep my balance as another shudder rolled through the ridge. "I know I said I wanted to leave the pack, but I didn't mean I wanted to leave the entire continent via a volcanic ejection. Is this normal rogue weather, or am I just that lucky?" Bastian didn't laugh this time. His face was set in a grim mask of concentration, his silver eyes tracking the path of the smoke as it began to drift down the slopes. "It's an old fire vent. It hasn't breathed in 100 years. The elders used to say the mountain sleeps on a bed of iron and embers, but I thought it was just a story to keep pups away from the high caves." "Well, the story is currently waking up and looking for breakfast," I muttered. The heat from the burning ruins of the cabin was now competing with a different kind of warmth, a heavy, sulfurous humidity that began to settle over the clearing. The snow was starting to melt, turning the ground into a treacherous slurry of gray slush and mud. Bastian turned to me, his hands gripping my shoulders. His touch was the only steady thing in a world that was literally falling apart. "The second cabin is tucked into a granite shelf 3 miles up. It's built into the rock itself. If the mountain is going to spit fire, that's the only place that won't turn into a funeral pyre." 3 miles? In this? I looked at the dark, shifting forest. The trees were swaying even though there was no wind, their roots screaming as the earth shifted beneath them. "Lead the way, mountain man, but if I die in a landslide, I'm haunting your next house." We ran. There was no room for tactical grace now, only raw animal desperation. Bastian didn't shift back into the wolf. We needed the agility of our human forms to navigate the crumbling goat tracks that led higher into the peaks. He stayed half a step ahead of me, his hand constantly reaching back to catch mine, pulling me over fissures that were beginning to crack the frozen earth. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had just survived an alpha's wrath and a cabin fire, only to be chased by the geography itself.
"Almost there," Bastian grunted, his breath hitching as we scrambled up a vertical face of shale. We rounded a jagged corner of granite, and there it was, a tiny, squat structure that looked more like a cave with a wooden door than a house. It was tucked deep under a massive overhanging ledge, shielded from the falling ash and the tremors. Bastian shoved the door open and practically tossed me inside before slamming it shut and throwing a heavy iron bolt that looked like it had been forged by a giant. The silence inside was sudden and deafening, the stone walls dampening the roar of the mountain. I slumped against the door, gasping for air that didn't taste like burnt matches. The space was tiny, barely enough room for a hearth, a small table, and, as promised, a bed that took up nearly half the floor space. "You okay?" Bastian asked, his voice low and thick with concern. He was standing inches from me, his naked chest streaked with soot and sweat, his heat radiating off him like a furnace. "I'm fine," I wheezed, looking up at him. "But I think I've officially reached my quota for high-stakes escapes for the week. If you tell me there's a flood coming next, I'm just going to sit down and drown." Bastian stepped closer, his presence effectively pinning me against the door. He didn't look at the mountain, he looked at me. Then his eyes dropped to the floor, and his expression went from protective to dangerously sharp. "Gunnora," he whispered, "don't move." I looked down. Water wasn't coming in under the door. Something else was. A thick, slow-moving ribbon of dark, viscous oil was seeping through a crack in the stone floor, and it smelled exactly like the Alpha's pitch.
Chapter 12. The Tightening Noose. I stared at the black sludge. It wasn't volcanic. It didn't have the sulfurous tang of the mountain's breath. This was man-made, bitumen and pine resin, the kind of concoction we use to waterproof the pack's longships, and the same stuff Vance had used to burn the first cabin. "The crack," I whispered, my warrior brain overriding my exhaustion. "This cabin isn't just built into the rock, it's built over a natural drainage vent. If they've found the upper opening, they're pouring it in from the ledge above us." Bastian finished, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't panic. He just reached out and grabbed a heavy wool blanket, shoving it into the crack to stem the flow. He didn't retreat. He just regrouped. He knew about this place. "He's not trying to burn us out this time," I said, watching the blanket turn black as it soaked up the oil. "He's trying to trap us. If he lights this, the vent becomes a chimney. We'll be roasted in a stone oven." Bastian turned to me, and for a second, the high stakes of the world outside vanished. The tiny cabin was lit only by the faint, pre-dawn light filtering through a single slit in the rock. We were trapped, surrounded by a mountain that was shaking and a pack that was trying to cook us alive. And yet, looking at Bastian, I felt a strange, fierce surge of adrenaline. He really is a persistent bastard, isn't he? I almost have to admire the dedication. Most people just send a strongly worded letter. Bastian didn't laugh. He stepped towards me, his hands finding my waist. He pulled me away from the door and towards the center of the room, his touch firm and possessive. "He won't get in, Gunnora, and he won't light that pitch, not while I'm breathing."
"Bastian, we're stuck," I pointed out, my hands resting on his warm, soot-stained shoulders. "Unless you have a secret tunnel that leads to a tropical island, we're in a bit of a predicament." "I have something better," he said, his silver eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of the mountain air and the cedar scent that had become my sanctuary. "I have you, and you have me, and Vance has forgotten that a rogue doesn't fight for a pack. A rogue fights for what's his." The intimacy in the tiny space was suffocating in the best way possible. Outside, the mountain groaned again, but inside, the only sound was the synchronized thrum of our heartbeats. Bastian's hands slid up from my waist to my back, pressing me flush against his heat. The borrowed tunic I was wearing felt like a thin, pointless barrier. "Is this the part where you tell me you have a plan?" I murmured, my head tilting back to invite his touch. "This is the part where I tell you that I love how you look when you're plotting a murder," he growled, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of my neck. "And then I'm going to show you exactly why they call this the Savage Wilds."
He kissed me then, a hard, primal thing that tasted of desperation and defiance. It wasn't a gentle, romantic gesture. It was a claim. It was a promise that as long as we were together, the rest of the world could burn. I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his damp hair. For a moment, the oil on the floor and the alpha on the ledge didn't exist. There was only the heat of the rogue and the fierce, unyielding soul of the woman who had chosen him. Then, a heavy metallic clink sounded from the roof, the sound of an iron grappling hook catching on the stone ledge right above the chimney vent.
Chapter 13. The Chimney Sweep. The sound of the grappling hook was like a starting pistol. The romantic haze evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of a predator. Bastian broke the kiss, his eyes darting to the chimney opening, a narrow slit in the roof designed to let out smoke, now a potential entry point for a very motivated alpha. "They're coming down the vent," I whispered, already looking around the tiny room for something more effective than an iron poker. Vance is always fond of dramatic entrances. He probably thinks he's being clever. Bastian moved to the hearth, but he didn't grab a weapon. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron pot filled with cold, congealed fat from the previous week's hunt. If he wants to come down the chimney, we should make sure he has a very fast trip. I realized what he was doing, and a slow, wicked grin spread across my face. "You're going to grease the vent?" "I'm going to make it impossible for him to hold on to anything but his own regret," Bastian said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. While Bastian scrambled up the stone wall to smear the tallow into the narrow chimney opening, I moved to the window slit. I could see the flickers of torches on the ledge above us. There were at least 5 of them. They weren't shifting. The ledge was too narrow and the mountain was too unstable for a full wolf form. They were using ropes, 16th century style, thinking they had us pinned in a stone box. "They've got the pitch barrels ready. If they don't get a response soon, they're going to tip the rest in and light the fuse." Bastian dropped back down to the floor, his hands covered in grease. He looked at me, his chest heaving. "We can't stay in here, Gunnora. The grease will slow them down, but it won't stop the fire." "Then we go out," I said. I looked at the heavy iron door. "But not through there. They'll have 3 men waiting with spears the moment that bolt slides back." "The drainage vent," Bastian said, his eyes widening. "The crack in the floor? If we can widen it—" "It's granite, Bastian. We're not gophers." "No," he said, stepping toward the table and flipping it over to reveal a hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath. "But I am a miner's son, and I have 3 pounds of black powder I traded from a merchant in the southern ports last spring." My heart did a little somersault. Black powder was rare, volatile, and incredibly dangerous in a confined space. It was perfect. "You had explosives this whole time and you didn't mention it?" I asked, helping him haul out a small, heavy wooden keg. "Bastian, I think I'm in love with your inventory management," he said, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he began to lay a trail of powder toward the crack in the stone. "When this goes, the drainage vent will collapse downward into the lower caverns. It'll be a 30-foot drop into the dark. We'll have to jump together." I looked at the keg, then at the chimney where the first sounds of a scrambling, greasy alpha were starting to echo. Vance was swearing, his boots sliding against the tallow-slicked stone. A 30-foot drop into a dark hole or staying here to be turned into a human candle. I shrugged, grabbing Bastian's hand and interlacing my fingers with his. "I've had worse Sunday afternoons. Let's do it." Bastian grabbed a stray ember from the hearth with a pair of iron tongs. He looked at me, his silver eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "Together," he said. "Together," I echoed. He dropped the ember onto the powder trail. The fuse hissed, a bright, sparking line of fire racing across the floor toward the keg wedged in the granite. We lunged toward the center of the room, Bastian wrapping his massive arms around me, shielding my body with his own as the world prepared to turn inside out. The roar of the explosion was a physical fist that slammed into us, but it was drowned out by a much louder, more terrifying sound from above, a scream of pure, unadulterated rage as the Alpha finally lost his grip on the chimney and began his greased descent. Chapter 14. The Plunge. The world didn't just end, it shattered. The explosion was a physical punch that stole my breath, followed instantly by the terrifying, weightless sensation of the floor dropping out from under us. I didn't have time to scream. I only had time to grip Bastian's tunic as his massive arms locked around me, pulling my head into his chest. We fell into absolute darkness. The roar of the blast was replaced by the rush of wind and the sickening lurch of gravity. It felt like an eternity, but it must have been only seconds. We hit water, cold, shocking, lightless water that knocked the air from my lungs and stung my eyes. It wasn't a deep pool, it was a rushing underground river. We tumbled violently, scraping against submerged rocks, the current trying to tear us apart. But Bastian's grip never wavered. He was an anchor in the chaos, his strength defying the force of the water. He hauled us to the surface, sputtering and gasping. The air down here was thick, damp, and smelled of ancient limestone and the sulfurous aftertaste of the black powder. "Gunnora!" His voice echoed strangely off the cavern walls, thick with panic. "Are you whole? Talk to me." "I'm here," I coughed, spitting out grit and water. "I'm wet, I'm freezing, and I think I left my dignity back in the cabin, but I'm whole." Bastian dragged us toward a rocky bank, his boots scraping for purchase on the slick stone. We collapsed on the cold, wet shale, shivering violently. It was pitch black. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, but I could feel Bastian scrambling closer, his hands moving frantically over my arms, my ribs, my face, checking for broken bones. "You're freezing," he growled, pulling me into his lap, trying to share what little body heat he had left. His skin was icy wet, but underneath, the furnace of his rogue blood was fighting back. "We survived," I whispered, my teeth chattering. "Bastian, we actually did it." "We're not out yet," he said, his voice tight. Above us, muted by tons of rock, a dull thud echoed. Then another. It sounded like rocks shifting, or maybe bodies hitting the rubble of a destroyed cabin. "Did you hear that?" I asked, leaning into his warmth, his touch searingly gentle in the blind dark. "But his pack is still up there, and they know we didn't die in the fire." We sat there for a moment in the suffocating darkness, two drowned rats catching their breath in the belly of the earth. The intimacy was visceral, wet clothes, shivering bodies pressed together for survival, the absolute reliance on the other's presence to keep the panic at bay. Then, over the rush of the underground river, I heard something else, a scraping sound, like claws on wet stone, coming from deeper in the cavern.
Chapter 15. The Echo in the Dark. Bastian went still instantly, his body shifting from protector to predator against my back. The scraping sound came again. Scritch, splash, scritch. Closer this time. Down here, without light, my human eyes were useless. I was blind. But Bastian had spent a decade relying on senses that most pack wolves let dull with comfort. "What is it?" I breathed into the freezing air, my hand finding the hilt of the dagger still strapped to his thigh. It was comforting to know that even when blown up and drowned, Bastian didn't travel without steel. "Not wolf," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rushing water. "Too light, too jerky. Cave dwellers, blind baths or rock crawlers. They're attracted to the noise." Wonderful. I was just thinking this date needed more vermint. I tried to stand, my legs shaking from the cold and the adrenaline crash. Bastian rose with me, his hand finding my waist in the darkness, guiding me away from the water's edge. "Stay close to the wall. Use your left hand to track the stone. I'll lead." We moved like ghosts through the suffocating blackness. I relied entirely on touch, the slick, freezing damp of the limestone wall under my left palm, and the solid, radiating heat of Bastian's back, just inches in front of me.
It was a terrifying kind of intimacy, to be completely helpless, to surrender all control to another person in a situation where one wrong step meant a broken neck in a dark pit. Yet I never hesitated. My trust in him was absolute. If Bastian said step, I stepped. If he said freeze, I froze. The air grew colder, if that was possible, and the smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the sterile scent of deep earth and stagnant water.
"The ceiling is dropping," Bastian murmured, ducking low. I followed suit, feeling the jagged rock brush against my sodden tunic. We crawled for what felt like hours, the scraping sounds following us, always just out of reach in the echo chamber of the tunnels. My knees were raw, my hands numb. Just as I thought I couldn't move another inch, Bastian stopped. I bumped into his back. He reached around, grabbing my arm to steady me. "Do you smell that?" he asked. I sniffed the air, pushing past the damp stone and my own fear. There it was, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to a tracker. Pine needles, cold, fresh air. "The surface," I gasped, hope surging through me like a shot of strong spirits. "We're close." "It's above us," Bastian said. He moved away from me, and I heard him feeling the wall in front of us. A chimney vent, natural rock. It's steep, Gunnora, almost vertical. I reached out in the dark until I found his arm, gripping the cold, wet muscle. If you slip, I promised fiercely, I will catch you." I heard him shift, preparing to scale the rock face in the pitch black. Then his hand found my face, his thumb tracing my jawline in the dark. "If you slip," he promised fiercely, "I will catch you."
Chapter 16. The Ascent to Iron. The climb was agonizing. It wasn't a hike, it was a vertical clawing up a wet, jagged throat of rock in absolute darkness. Bastian went first, finding the handholds by feel and scent, his massive frame testing the stability of the stone before I risked my weight on it. My fingers were numb, violently shaking with cold and exertion. Every muscle screamed, but the fresh air drifting down from above was a siren song, pulling me upward. "Remember," Bastian's voice echoed down, calm and steady. 3 points of contact. Don't reach until your feet are set." "I know how to climb, rogue," I grunted, jamming my boot into a crevice he had just vacated. "I know you do," he said, a hint of warmth in his tone. "I just like hearing you argue. It means you're not dead yet." We were 50 feet up, wedged in a chimney barely wide enough for Bastian's shoulders, when my foot slipped on a patch of slime. I gasped as my weight dropped, my fingers scrabbling uselessly against the wet rock. Before I could fall more than an inch, an iron grip clamped onto my wrist. Bastian had braced his legs across the chimney and reached down, catching me with incredible speed. He didn't just hold me, he hauled me up one-handed until I could find purchase again, pulling me level with him. We were chest to chest, suspended in the dark shaft, our breaths mingling in the freezing air. "I told you I'd catch you," he growled, his forehead knocking gently against mine. The sheer physical power of the man was staggering. He was holding us both up by sheer force of will. "Show off," I whispered, though my heart was hammering against his chest. We continued upward. The air grew fresher, colder, and then I saw it. A tiny patch of gray light above us. Not sunlight, moonlight filtered through heavy winter clouds. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We reached the top, pulling ourselves over a lip of frozen granite and collapsing onto a snow-covered ledge. We were out. We were alive. We lay there for a moment, gasping in the frigid, clean air, looking up at the sky. Bastian rolled onto his side, propping his head on his hand to look at me. He was covered in mud, soot, and rock dust, his hair plastered to his skull. He looked magnificent. "We beat the mountain," I said, an exhausted smile spreading across my face. Bastian didn't smile back. His body had gone rigid again, his head tilted toward the wind. The silver in his eyes caught the moonlight, sharp and cold.
Gunnora, he whispered, his hand moving to cover my mouth, silencing me instantly. I froze, and then I heard it. Not the wind, not the mountain groaning. Voices, low, angry, and terrifyingly close. He has to have come out here. The vents all lead to this ridge. It was Bram's voice, Vance's second in command. We hadn't climbed to freedom. We had climbed right into the middle of the Iron Reach Pack's search party.
Chapter 17. The Breath of the Hunter. Bastian's hand was a warm, heavy seal over my mouth, his fingers smelling of wet stone and the scorched tallow of the cabin. I didn't move. I barely let my heart beat. Through the thin veil of a snow-laden hemlock branch, I could see Bram's boots, heavy, fur-lined leather crusted with frozen mud, not 6 feet from my nose. "Check the crevice," Bram barked, his voice rasping from the cold. They couldn't have gone far. No one survives that fall and the river unless the mountain itself is looking out for them. I felt Bastian's chest vibrate against my back, a low, silent snarl that never reached his throat. We were wedged into a shallow depression under a granite overhang, our bodies so tightly entwined that I couldn't tell where my shivering ended and his heat began. In the 16th century, being an outcast usually meant a lonely death in a ditch, but as Bram's shadow passed over our hiding spot, I realized I'd never felt less alone. If they find us, I thought, my eyes tracking the movement of a second scout's spear, I hope Bastian knows I'm going to use his extremely large shoulder as a springboard to tackle Bram. The humor was a thin shield against the sheer terror of our situation. We were exhausted, half-drowned, and weaponless. My iron poker was somewhere at the bottom of an underground river, probably being used by a very confused fish. All we had was each other, and the raw biological fury of our shifting blood. Bastian leaned closer, his lips brushing my shell of my ear. The sensation was a jolt of pure electricity, a reminder that even in the mouth of death, we were a unit. He didn't whisper. He just breathed, a rhythmic, grounding presence that told me to wait.
Bram stopped. He looked directly at the hemlock tree. I saw his nostrils flare. He was a tracker too. He was looking for the scent of the woman he'd known for a decade, but I didn't smell like Gunnora of the Iron Reach anymore. I smelled like the rogue. I smelled like cedar, rain, and the fierce, unyielding musk of a man who belonged to no one but himself. "Nothing," Bram spat, kicking a pile of snow. "The scent is gone. It's all just sulfur and wet dog out here. Let's move to the lower ridge. If they're dead, the crows will find them by sunrise." The crunch of their boots receded, fading into the rhythmic whistle of the mountain wind. We stayed frozen for a long minute, the silence stretching between us like a taut bowstring. Bastian finally pulled his hand away, but he didn't pull back his body. He stayed pressed against me, his head dropping to my shoulder. His voice thick with the strain of the hunt. "You know," I whispered, turning in the cramped space until our noses were inches apart. "For a guy who lives in total isolation, you're remarkably good at the whole cuddling for survival thing. Is there a manual I should read?" Bastian's eyes caught the moonlight, the silver swirling with a deep, possessive heat. "The manual is simple, Gunnora. I don't let go of what's mine." He reached out, his thumb catching a smear of mud on my cheek and wiping it away with a tenderness that made my breath hitch. The high stakes of the world outside, the pack, the mountain, the cold, all of it felt secondary to the way he was looking at me. "We need to move," I said, though my body was leaning into his. "Then we burn him," Bastian said, standing up and pulling me to my feet in one fluid motion. We stepped out from the overhang, the vast white expanse of the ridge stretching out before us. But as we turned toward the path that led to the summit, a low, wet cough echoed from the shadows of the rocks behind us. Chapter 18. The Sovereign Soul. The cough was followed by the sound of something heavy dragging through the slush. I spun around, my hands curling into fists, my wolf senses screaming. Emerging from the darkness of a jagged rock cluster was Vance, or what was left of him.
He was a mess. His fine wool tunic was shredded. His face was a map of bruises and deep lacerations from his trip down the chimney, and he was clutching his side where the black powder blast had clearly caught him. But he was alive, and he was smiling. You were always the difficult one, Gunnora," Vance wheezed, his voice wet with blood. He wasn't holding a sword, he was holding a heavy iron torch, unlit, but its weight was enough to crush a skull. "I should have drowned you in the birthing pool." Bastian stepped in front of me, a wall of protective muscle. "You're done, Vance. Your pack thinks you're dead. Your mountain tried to eat you. Walk away while you have legs to carry you." "I don't need a pack to kill a rogue and a whore," Vance spat, his eyes wild with the kind of madness that comes when an alpha loses his grip on reality. I stepped out from behind Bastian's shoulder. I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel the cold anymore. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. In the 16th century, a woman's life was defined by who she served. Tonight, I served no one. "I'm not a whore, Vance. I'm the person who taught your scouts how to track. I'm the person who kept your borders safe while you sat by the fire and grew fat on the meat I killed. And I'm the person who is going to watch you fall." Bastian glanced at me, a smirk tugging at his lips despite the stakes. "She does have a way with words, doesn't she?" "Shut up, Bastian," I murmured, but I caught his hand, our fingers locking. The intimacy was our weapon. Our total, unwavering devotion to one another was a force Vance couldn't comprehend. Vance lunged. It wasn't a tactical move. It was a desperate, animalistic heave. He swung the heavy iron torch towards Bastian's head. Bastian didn't flinch. He caught the iron mid-swing with his bare hand, the sound of the impact echoing like a hammer on an anvil. They grappled, two massive forces of nature locked in a struggle of pure physical dominance. No knives, no guns, just the raw strength of the wolf and the man. I didn't stand by and watch. I moved to Vance's blind side, my fingers finding the pressure points I knew were weakened by his injuries. "Together," Bastian roared, his muscles bulging as he forced Vance back towards the edge of the ridge. We moved in a perfect, brutal dance. Every time Vance tried to find purchase, I was there to unbalance him. Every time he tried to strike me, Bastian was there to absorb the blow. We were a single organism, a united front that left no room for his hate. But Vance was an alpha for a reason. With a roar of pure, desperate rage, he threw his weight forward, tackling both of us. We went down in a tangle of limbs, sliding through the ice and mud towards the steep drop-off of the eastern face. Bastian managed to dig his heels into the frozen earth, stopping our momentum just inches from the edge. Vance, however, was half draped over the precipice, his fingers clawing at the slick stone. Bastian had him by the collar of his ruined tunic. He could have let go. He should have let go. "Finish it," he hissed, his eyes fixed on Bastian's. Bastian looked at me. He was waiting for my word. The high stakes of our future hung in the balance of a single choice. Chapter 19. The Rejection Reversed. The wind howled around us, a cold, mournful sound that seemed to demand a sacrifice. Bastian's grip on Vance was the only thing keeping the Alpha from a 300-foot drop onto the granite teeth of the valley below. I knelt in the snow beside Bastian, my hand resting on his tense forearm. I could feel the tremor in his muscles, the primal urge to simply open his hand and end the threat forever. Vance looked up at us, his face a mask of bloody defiance, waiting for the killing blow he thought he deserved. "Bastian," I said, my voice steady and clear against the gale. "Give me the word, Gunnora." Bastian growled, his silver eyes never leaving Vance's. "He rejected you. He tried to burn you. He doesn't get to breathe the same air as you anymore." I looked at Vance. I saw the smallness of him. He wasn't a king. He was a bully whose kingdom had evaporated the moment he stopped being feared. To kill him here, in the dark, was to give him a warrior's death he hadn't earned. No, I said. Bastian blinked, his focus shifting to me for a split second. No? Pull him up, I commanded. With a grunt of pure, staggering strength, Bastian hauled Vance back onto the solid ground of the ridge. The alpha collapsed in a heap, coughing and shivering, looking at us with utter confusion. Why? Vance wheezed. You think this makes you better than me? I don't care about being better than you, I said, standing over him. I reached out and took Bastian's hand, pulling him up to stand beside me. We were two silhouettes against the moon, a pair of outcasts who had found a sovereignty that didn't require a crown. I'm not killing you, Vance, I continued, my voice cold as the ice beneath my feet. Because you're already dead. Your pack has seen you fall. They've seen you lose to a rogue and a woman you thought was nothing. If you go back to them, you'll be a ghost, a joke told over the winter fires. I leaned down, my face inches from his. I reject you, Vance. I reject your pack, your laws, and your name. You are nothing to me. The look on his face was more satisfying than any blade could have been. It was the look of a man who had realized his power was an illusion. Bastian wrapped his arm around my waist, his heat a protective shield. He looked at Vance one last time, his silver eyes flashing with a final, silent warning. If I ever see your shadow on this mountain again, I won't need a cliff to finish what you started. We turned our backs on him. It was the ultimate insult, the ultimate sign of our victory. We walked away, through the snow and the moonlight, leaving the broken alpha to the silence of the savage wilds. We headed higher, toward the ridge where the air was thin and the stars felt close enough to touch. My heart was light, the weight of the Iron Reach pack finally, truly gone. I was Gunnora, and I was home. We reached the summit, a flat plateau of granite that overlooked the entire northern valley. The mountain had stopped groaning, the smoke had cleared, the world was still. Bastian stopped and turned me to face him. He didn't say a word. He just cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with an intensity that made my knees weak. Gunnora, he whispered, his voice a low, honeyed rumble. Yes, Rogue? I think, he said, leaning down until our lips were a hair's breadth apart, that we're going to need a much bigger cabin. I laughed, the sound bright and free in the night air. I reached up, my fingers tangling in his dark, messy hair, pulling him down to close the distance. The kiss was everything, victory, sanctuary, and a promise of a future that belonged only to us. But as our lips met, a new sound echoed from the valley below, not a howl of a wolf, but the deep, rhythmic tolling of a massive iron bell, the kind only used to announce the arrival of a king's army. Chapter 20: The Sovereign Wild. The iron bell didn't just ring, it bruised the air. It was a heavy, rhythmic thrum that spoke of tax collectors, royal decrees, and far too many men in polished breastplates. Down in the valley, the winding trail was a river of torchlight. The king's southern army had arrived, likely drawn by the smoke of Vance's temper tantrum. It was the 16th century version of a very loud, very unwanted housewarming party. Well, I said, leaning my back against Bastian's solid chest as the wind whipped my tangled hair across my face. There goes the neighborhood. I don't suppose you have a no trespassing sign large enough for a battalion of heavy cavalry? Bastian's arms tightened around my waist, his heat a defiant wall against the encroaching chill. His chin rested on the crown of my head, and I could feel the low, steady vibration of a growl deep in his sternum. It wasn't a growl of fear, it was the sound of a man who had finally found something worth keeping and realized the rest of the world was a very inconvenient distraction. The king's men don't climb this high, Gunnora, he murmured, his voice a rich, grounding honey in the dark. They like their roads flat and their wine served in silver. They'll see the ruins of the Iron Reach Hall, find Vance shivering in the mud, and decide the mountain is cursed.
They always do. Cursed, I mused, tilting my head back to look at him. His silver eyes were focused on the valley, but as I moved, they snapped to mine with a devastating intensity. Bastian turned me in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup my face. His palms were rough, calloused, and searingly warm. In the absence of the pack bond, every touch from him felt amplified, a direct conversation between his soul and mine. There was no magic here, no glowing marks or destiny-bound spells. There was just a man who pulled me from the snow, and a woman who had decided he was the only kingdom she ever wanted to serve.
"You aren't cursed, Gunnora," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip. "You're free, and if the king wants to claim these peaks, he'll have to learn how to track a wolf that doesn't want to be found. But I think he'll find the savage wilds a bit too uncivilized for his tastes." "Good," I said, my hands finding the firm, soot-stained muscle of his chest. I felt fierce, not because I held a blade, but because I held his heart. The intimacy between us was a physical weight, more substantial than the stone beneath our feet. The bell continued to toll in the distance, a fading reminder of a world we had both outgrown. Bastian leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and the raw, honest heat of the wild, was the only thing that mattered. "The second cabin is waiting," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. "It's small, but it's high enough that even the eagles have to knock. We can start there." "Starting from scratch with a rogue in a cave," I said, a genuine happy smirk tugging at my lips. My mother always said I'd marry for status. I can't wait to see the look on her face when she realizes my new status is sovereign of absolutely nowhere. Bastian didn't laugh. He just pulled me into a kiss that tasted of victory and the untamed future. It was a slow, deep claim that silenced the valley and the bells. We were two rejects who had built a throne out of shadows and snow. As we turned together to walk toward the highest peaks, the first light of dawn began to touch the summit, turning the world to gold, not because of magic, but because the sun finally realized we were still standing.
The bells of the Southern Army are tolling, and the sanctuary Gunnora and Bastian fought so hard to build is under threat once again. How will they face the King's steel after surviving the Alpha's fire? If you're as gripped by this us-against-the-world bond as I am, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Z's Romance so you never miss a heartbeat of their journey. Before you go, I want to see those comments. If you didn't get a chance at the beginning, tell us now. Where in the world are you listening from? Reading your responses is the highlight of my day. Thank you for spending your time in the wild with us. Until next time, stay devoted, stay fierce.